silent. My mother's smile froze, and my brother realized something he had never considered before. I wasn't the family disappointment. I was the secret they didn't understand. The dinner was held at the Grand Meridian Hotel downtown, the kind of place with crystal chandeliers and staff who move like they're gliding. My brother Daniel was getting engaged to Vanessa Montgomery, whose father just happened to be Colonel Richard Montgomery, retired Army intelligence, now a defense consultant with enough influence to make senators nervous. My family had been rehearsing for this night like it was a corporate merger. My mother had called me twice that afternoon. "Please," she said carefully, "keep it simple tonight." I knew what that meant. Don't mention the deployments. Don't mention the commendations. Don't mention the fact that I outranked most of the men in that room. My family preferred the version of me that worked in administration. That was easier to explain at dinner parties. It was less threatening. Daniel had always been the golden one. Business degree, polished handshake, photogenic engagement photos. Meanwhile, I had mud-stained boots and a record most civilians couldn't pronounce properly. When I arrived at the hotel, my mother pulled me aside near the entrance. Her fingers tightened around my arm, just enough to remind me who she thought I was. "Elise," she whispered, smiling for passing guests. "Don't embarrass us." I held her gaze. How exactly would I do that? "By correcting people," she said sharply. "By making it about you. Tonight is about Daniel." There it was. The assumption that my existence automatically shifted attention. I nodded once and walked inside. The ballroom was already filling. Vanessa stood near the stage in a pale blue gown, glowing under chandelier light. Daniel looked confident, relaxed, already absorbing the admiration. I stayed near the back, content to observe. I wasn't there to compete. I was there because he was my brother. At least I thought I was. Then I heard it. "And this is Elise," my mother was saying to a group of Vanessa's relatives. "She works in support services. Very detail-oriented support services." I almost laughed. I had led convoy security through active zones. I had coordinated evacuations under fire. I had briefed senior command during intelligence escalations. Support services. The word tasted like erasure. I didn't correct her. I didn't say anything. I simply took a glass of water and moved toward the back of the room. That's when I noticed him, Colonel Montgomery, standing near the podium, watching. And when his eyes met mine, something shifted. Not recognition from a social introduction. Recognition from somewhere else entirely. At first I thought I was imagining it. Colonel Montgomery had the kind of stare that made people straighten unconsciously, even retired. He wasn't looking at me the way strangers look at guests. He was assessing, remembering, connecting details. I looked away first, not because I was nervous, but because I had spent years learning that attention could become a weapon. My family had weaponized it differently. They didn't expose me. They minimized me. When I earned my first promotion, Mum said, "That's nice, but don't let it make you difficult." When I came home from my second deployment, Daniel asked if I was finally done playing soldier. When I received a classified commendation, my father asked if it came with a raise, so I learned to fold my achievements into silence. At dinner, I was seated 3 tables away from my parents, between a distant cousin and Vanessa's aunt, who asked if I helped with filing in the army. I smiled politely. Something like that. Across the room, Daniel rose to give his speech. He thanked Vanessa, her parents, our parents, and everyone who helped shape him into the man he was. My mother dabbed her eyes. My father looked proud. Then Daniel laughed and said, "Even my sister Elise made it tonight. She's not much for fancy events, but we're glad she cleaned up." The room chuckled. My fingers tightened around my water glass, not because the joke was cruel by itself, but because it carried years of permission. Everyone laughed because he had made it safe to laugh. My mother glanced at me with warning in her eyes. "Don't react. Don't embarrass us." I didn't. I sat still. Daniel continued, "Elise has always taken the unconventional route. We're just happy she found something Vanessa looked uncomfortable, but Daniel didn't notice. He was performing, and I was the easy punchline. Then Colonel Montgomery stood. The room settled quickly. He walked to the microphone with the calm authority of someone who never had to demand silence. "I appreciate Daniel's humour," he began, voice even. "But before the evening continues, I need to correct something." My mother's smile stiffened. Daniel blinked. The Colonel looked directly at me. "Major Elise Carter is not someone who merely found something steady." The ballroom went so quiet, I could hear silverware stop mid-air. My mother turned slowly toward me. "Major," he said it, clearly, publicly. Daniel's face changed. First, confusion, then disbelief. Colonel Montgomery continued. "Several years ago, during an operation I am not at liberty to discuss in detail, Major Carter coordinated the evacuation of personnel under conditions most people in this room cannot imagine. She saved lives, including 2 men from my former unit." My pulse slowed, not from fear, from exposure, the kind I'd avoided for years. The Colonel's voice softened. I knew who she was before tonight, and suddenly every lie by omission had nowhere left to hide. The silence didn't just linger, it thickened. It pressed against every crystal glass and polished plate in that ballroom. Daniel was still standing near his chair, smile half-formed and completely lost. My mother's hand hovered mid-air, napkin frozen inches from her face. My father stared at the Colonel like a man who had just realised the rules of the room had changed without warning. Colonel Montgomery didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatise. He simply continued. "Major Carter's leadership during Operation Silver Ridge prevented a catastrophic loss of civilian and military life. I reviewed the reports personally." A few people gasped quietly. Vanessa looked at me with something like awe. I wished she wouldn't. Attention was unfamiliar territory inside my own family. The Colonel shifted his stance slightly. It takes a rare combination of discipline and moral courage to make decisions. Under pressure like that, that kind of steadiness is not something you stumble into. My brother swallowed visibly. The joke he had made minutes earlier was now curdling in the air. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exposed. For years I had allowed my family to shrink me because it was easier than fighting, easier than correcting, easier than explaining that I didn't need their validation, but I also didn't need their dismissal. The Colonel finally turned toward Daniel and Vanessa. "You're building a future together. I hope you learn to recognise strength when it's standing next to you." It wasn't cruel, it wasn't confrontational, but it was unmistakable. He handed the microphone back and returned to his seat. The room stayed silent for 3 long seconds before conversation resumed, hesitant at first, then buzzing louder than before. This time, the attention wasn't bending toward Daniel. It was drifting toward me. People at nearby tables leaned in subtly. Someone whispered my name, Major. My mother stood abruptly and made her way toward me. "Elise," she hissed under her breath, smile tight. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at her evenly. "You never asked." Her expression flickered between embarrassment and anger. "This wasn't the time. Neither were the last 10 years, I replied quietly. Daniel approached, jaw tight. "You let him do that," he said. "Do what? Make me look small?" I stared at him. I didn't say a word. He didn't have a response. Because the truth wasn't that I had embarrassed them. The truth was that their version of me had been built on convenience, and now it had cracked publicly. My father finally joined us. For the first time in my life, he didn't look annoyed or detached. He looked unsettled. "Why didn't you ever correct us?" he asked. It was almost genuine. I answered honestly, "Because I didn't think you wanted the correction." That landed harder than anything the Colonel had said. The rest of the dinner felt different. Conversation shifted. People asked questions, not about filing or support services, but about logistics, leadership, deployments. I answered calmly, without exaggeration. I didn't perform. I didn't gloat. I simply existed at full equal size. And for my family, that was the most uncomfortable part, because now the only thing truly exposed wasn't my rank, it was their pattern. The rest of the evening unfolded like a slow unravelling, not chaotic, not explosive, just subtle fractures spreading through a foundation that had always relied on presentation. I could feel the shift in how people looked at me. Not curiosity exactly, but recalibration. Conversations adjusted mid-sentence. Tone softened. Titles mattered. Respect changed its direction. Vanessa's mother approached first. Her smile no longer polite, but sincere. "We're honoured to have you here, Major," she said. Not Elise, not Daniel's sister. Major. My own mother stood a few steps behind her, watching the exchange, like someone studying a language she never bothered to learn. I could see it in her eyes. Calculation, embarrassment, a quiet awareness that something irreversible had happened. Daniel avoided me for nearly 20 minutes. When he finally approached, it wasn't with humour, it was with tension. "You could have told me," he said quietly. "Told you what?" I asked. "That you were... that..." I tilted my head slightly. "That what?" He hesitated. "Important." The word sounded foreign in his mouth. I didn't smile. "I am important," I said evenly, "whether you acknowledge it or not." He ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling. "You let us think you were..." Smaller. I didn't let anything happen. They had chosen the version of me that fit comfortably in their narrative. I simply stopped correcting it. My father joined us again, this time without my mother. "The Colonel said you saved men from his unit," he said carefully. "Twice." I nodded once. He exhaled slowly, like someone re-examining old memories. "Why didn't you ever bring that up?" Because every time I tried to share something, it was met with a joke, or a warning not to show off, or a reminder that real success looked different. But I didn't say that. I just replied. It didn't seem to matter here. That answer hurt him. I could see it. For years he had assumed my silence meant modesty. He never considered it might have been adaptation. My mother finally stepped closer. Her composure slightly cracked. "We never meant to diminish you," she said, voice tight. "Intent doesn't change impact," I replied calmly. That sentence landed between us like glass. The engagement dinner continued, but something had permanently shifted. Daniel's spotlight felt narrower. Vanessa seemed more attentive to the dynamics around her. And my mother, she was quieter than I had ever seen her in public. As dessert was served, Colonel Montgomery approached our family table one last time. "It was good to see you again, Major," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "You should be proud." Not accusatory, not sarcastic, just factual. After he walked away, my mother finally said the words she had never allowed herself to say. "We didn't know." I met her eyes. "You didn't want to know." Silence settled over the table, and for the first time, it wasn't heavy with dismissal. It was heavy with realization, because embarrassment hadn't come from me. It had come from years of minimizing something they were never willing to see clearly. And now the room had seen it for them. The dinner ended without another speech, but the damage, if that's what it was, had already been done. People lingered longer near our table than Daniel's. Few of his friends approached me to shake my hand, their tone respectful, even cautious. I could see it in Daniel's posture. The axis of the evening had tilted slightly off-centre, and he didn't like that. As we stepped outside into the cool night air, my mother finally dropped the practice smile she had worn for hours. "You could have warned us," she said quietly. Not angry, not sharp, just unsettled. "About what?" I asked. "About all of that." I studied her face under the streetlight. "You told me not to embarrass you." She didn't answer immediately. My father stood beside her, hands in his pockets, unusually silent. For once, he wasn't trying to smooth things over. He was thinking. "We didn't understand the scale of what you do," he said after a moment. "You never asked," I replied gently. That truth was uncomfortable, but it wasn't cruel. It was clean. Daniel walked up to us, tie loosened. It still is, I said calmly. Nothing I said changed that. You didn't say anything, he snapped. Exactly. Silence followed. He knew I was right. The only thing that had shifted was the narrative he had grown comfortable controlling. My mother exhaled sharply. We never meant for you to feel less. I met her gaze steadily. But I did. That was the part no one could argue with. Feelings aren't negotiable. My father stepped closer, his voice lower than usual. I think we've been operating on assumptions. About what? I asked. About who you are. That landed differently. For years I had been categorized. The practical one, the serious one, the one who didn't need attention. They had mistaken my independence for invulnerability, my silence for lack of achievement, my steadiness for absence of ambition. You thought I didn't care how I was introduced, I said quietly. You thought it didn't matter. My mother's expression softened, something like regret flickering there. It mattered, she admitted. That admission, small as it was, shifted more than the Colonel's speech had, because it was internal, not public. Just the four of us confronting a truth we had avoided for years. I don't need applause, I said calmly. I just need accuracy. My father nodded slowly. Daniel didn't speak again, but for the first time, he wasn't looking at me like competition. He was looking at me like recalculation, and recalculation is where growth begins. The ride home was quieter than any family car ride I could remember. No one reached for small talk. No one tried to rewrite the evening into something harmless. Daniel stared out the window, scrolling occasionally, but not typing. My mother sat rigid, replaying every interaction in her head. My father drove slower than usual, hands steady on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road like he was navigating something far more complex than traffic. I watched the city lights blur past and realised I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady. That was new. For years, any conflict with my family left me restless for days, replaying conversations and wondering if I had overreacted. Tonight, there was no doubt. I hadn't corrected anyone publicly. I hadn't demanded recognition. I had simply allowed someone else to speak the truth. When we reached my parents' house, no one rushed inside. The front porch light cast a soft yellow glow over the driveway. My mother turned to me first. You're staying for coffee, she said. It wasn't a request. It was an attempt at normalcy. I considered declining, but something told me this was the real conversation, the one without witnesses. Inside, the house felt smaller than it had earlier that day, familiar but slightly misaligned. We sat around the kitchen table. No decorations, no champagne, just the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of unspoken history. My father broke the silence. How long have you been a major? 2 years, I replied. Daniel blinked. 2 years, I nodded. Before that, I was a captain for 3. My mother looked genuinely stunned. Why didn't we know? I didn't rush the answer, because every time I mentioned work, it became a joke. The room went still. My father looked down at his hands. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. My mother's expression tightened. We were teasing, she said weakly. You weren't, I replied gently. You were minimizing. That word lingered in the air. It wasn't an accusation. It was a diagnosis. For years, my accomplishments had been trimmed to fit a narrative that made everyone else comfortable. If I was successful, it was luck. If I was promoted, it was timing. If I was deployed, it was desk work. They hadn't attacked me. They had simply reduced me. I didn't think it bothered you, Daniel said quietly. It did. He looked up, genuinely confused. Why didn't you say something? I met his eyes steadily, because I didn't think you'd listen. That hurt him. I could see it, but it wasn't said to wound. It was said to clarify. My father finally leaned back in his chair. He said quietly. That sentence felt more significant than any applause in a ballroom. My mother nodded slowly. We didn't realize what we were doing. I gave a small, tired smile. You do now. days were strangely quiet. No dramatic family group texts, no defensive justifications, no passive-aggressive comments disguised as humour. That silence felt heavier than confrontation, but not in a threatening way. It felt reflective. My phone buzzed once midweek with a message from Daniel. Coffee? It was short, direct, and uncharacteristically vulnerable. I agreed. We met at a small cafe near his office, the kind of place with exposed brick and low music that forced conversation instead of drowning it. Daniel looked different without the engagement spotlight around him. Less polished, more human. He stirred his drink longer than necessary before speaking. I rewatched some old videos last night, he said. Graduations, holidays, random dinners. I stayed quiet. You're barely in any of them, he continued. And when you are, you're off to the side. I almost smiled. I had noticed that years ago. I didn't think you cared, he admitted. About what? About being seen. I held his gaze. I cared. I just stopped fighting for it. He nodded slowly. I didn't realise how easy it was to overlook you. That sentence was raw, not defensive, not performative, just honest. It wasn't easy, I corrected gently. It was convenient. He winced, but he didn't argue. I thought you were stronger than needing attention, he said. Strength isn't the absence of need, I replied. It's the ability to carry it quietly. He leaned back, absorbing that. You never complained, he said. I never felt heard, I answered. Silence fell between us, but it wasn't hostile. It was recalibrating. When the Colonel said what he said, Daniel continued, I felt embarrassed. Not because you were accomplished, but because I realised I didn't know you. That confession shifted something. For the first time, this wasn't about comparison. It was about awareness. You knew the version that fit inside family dinners. I said calmly, not the one that existed outside of them. He nodded. I think I liked that version better, he admitted quietly. It made me feel bigger. There it was. The real truth. Minimizing someone else can inflate you artificially. I'm not here to compete, I said evenly. I never was. He exhaled slowly. I know that now. That moment wasn't dramatic. No tears, no grand apology, but it felt like the first honest conversation we'd had as adults. You didn't embarrass us, he added. We embarrassed ourselves. I didn't respond immediately. Then I said softly, embarrassment isn't the problem. Inaccuracy is. He smiled faintly. It wasn't a promise shouted into the air. It was a quiet commitment, and sometimes those last longer. That weekend, my mother invited me over for lunch. Not a formal dinner, not a holiday gathering, just lunch. The simplicity of it felt intentional. When I arrived, she was already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, moving with focused purpose instead of social performance. I'm making your favourite, she said without turning around. That detail alone told me something had shifted. For years, she had cooked based on what impressed guests or suited Daniel's tastes. Today, she had remembered mine. We sat at the kitchen table where most family decisions had been made over the years, but the energy was different now, less hierarchical, less rehearsed. I've been thinking about that night, she began carefully, about what I said before the dinner. I waited. When I told you not to embarrass us, she continued, I wasn't protecting our reputation. I was protecting my comfort. That admission landed heavily, not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific. What were you uncomfortable with? I asked. She hesitated before answering. That you operate in spaces I don't understand. That you carry responsibilities I can't relate to. It made me feel small. I hadn't expected that. I had expected pride to be the issue, not insecurity. So you minimized me, I said gently. She nodded once. It was easier than admitting I didn't know how to talk about your world. For the first time, I saw the dynamic clearly. It wasn't just favoritism. It was familiarity. Daniel's business world mirrored theirs. My military career didn't. And instead of learning it, they simplified it. You could have asked, voice softened. I didn't want to feel ignorant in front of other people. That vulnerability was new. My mother rarely admitted uncertainty. I didn't need you to understand everything, I said. I just needed you to respect it. She met my eyes and nodded slowly. I do. There was no dramatic apology, no grand gesture, just understanding settling into place. After lunch, we stepped outside into the backyard. The air felt lighter than it had in years. I've been telling people you're a major, she said almost shyly. I raised an eyebrow. Have you? She smiled faintly. Yes, and I've stopped joking about your job. That mattered more than she probably realized. Change doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like correction in small conversations. As I left that afternoon, she hugged me tighter than usual. Not possessive, not performative, just intentional. And for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like I was shrinking myself to fit inside that embrace. It felt like I was standing at full height. The real shift didn't happen at the cafe or over lunch. It happened a week later at another public event. Vanessa's parents were hosting a small follow-up gathering to formally announce the wedding date. And this time I wasn't an afterthought. When I walked into the room, Daniel introduced me himself. This is my sister, Major Elise Carter, he said clearly, without hesitation or humour. The difference in tone was subtle but powerful. No qualifiers, no minimising, just fact. I noticed my mother watching closely, measuring reactions. There were no awkward laughs this time, no confused expressions. People nodded respectfully. A few even asked thoughtful questions about logistics and leadership. Daniel didn't interrupt or redirect the conversation. He stood beside me quietly, letting me answer. That was new. Later, as we stood near the dessert table, Vanessa leaned in and said softly, I'm glad he corrected that. I looked at her. Corrected what? She smiled slightly. The way he used to talk about you. That acknowledgement surprised me more than the Colonel's speech had. It meant the pattern had been visible to outsiders all along. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't oversensitive. It had simply gone unchallenged until now. During the toast, Daniel raised his glass and said something unexpected. To family, he began. The kind that grows even when it's uncomfortable. His eyes flicked toward me for a second. It wasn't a dramatic apology. It was public recognition. That mattered. My father later joined me near the balcony. You look different, he said. How? Less cautious, I thought about that. He was right. For years, I had measured my words carefully in family settings, trimming stories, avoiding specifics, downplaying achievements. Now I didn't feel the need to shrink. I stopped managing other people's reactions. I said calmly. He nodded slowly. That's harder than most promotions. The evening flowed without tension. No side glances, no defensive humour, just normal conversation. It felt almost ordinary, which somehow made it extraordinary. When I left that night, my mother walked me to my car. I'm proud of you, she said plainly. No hesitation, no qualifiers. I studied her face for insincerity. There was none. Thank you, I replied. The words felt steady, not overdue. As I drove home, I realised something important. The Colonel's recognition had sparked the shift, but it wasn't what sustained it. What sustained it was accountability. Quiet, consistent adjustments in behaviour. My family hadn't transformed overnight. They had simply stopped denying what was already true. And that made all the difference. The weeks after that gathering felt steadier than any stretch of time. I could remember, not perfect, not magically healed, but stable. Daniel stopped using humour as a shield. My mother stopped introducing me as something vague and non-threatening. My father began asking real questions about my work, not surface-level ones meant to fill silence. It wasn't dramatic growth. It was incremental correction. One Sunday afternoon, my parents came over for dinner at my place. That had never happened before. I had always gone to them. Hosting them felt symbolic. I cooked something simple, nothing elaborate. We sat my table, and for once, I wasn't bracing for a comment that trimmed my edges. Halfway through the meal, my mother looked around the room and said, "You've built something solid here." She didn't mean the furniture, she meant my life. My father nodded. "You did it without leaning on anyone." That sentence carried more acknowledgement than years of polite praise ever had. "I leaned on people," I corrected gently. "Just not financially." They both smiled faintly at that. After dinner, Daniel pulled me aside near the kitchen counter. "I used to think you didn't care about how we saw you," he admitted. "I thought you were above it." "I wasn't above it," I said calmly. "I just got tired of fighting it." He nodded slowly. "I don't want you to feel like you have to fight for space here anymore." That was the shift. Not competition, not comparison, space. When they left that evening, I didn't feel relief that the night had gone smoothly. I felt something stronger. Equality. Not in rank, not in career, in respect. The next morning, I received a message from Colonel Montgomery. "Heard the dinner went well," it read. I smiled. Word travels in interesting ways. "It did," I replied. He responded with one final sentence. "Truth settles eventually." He was right. It doesn't explode. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It simply stabilizes the ground beneath it. I looked at my phone for a moment longer, then set it down. For years, I had accepted a smaller version of myself inside my own family because I thought it kept the peace. What I didn't realize was that shrinking never creates peace. It creates imbalance, and imbalance eventually exposes itself. My mother once told me not to embarrass them. The truth was, I never did. I just stopped hiding, and when I stopped hiding, they had to decide whether they were willing to see me clearly. They chose to, not because I demanded it loudly, not because I threatened to walk away, but because I stayed steady long enough for the truth to become undeniable. And that changed everything. A month after the engagement dinner, something happened that would have gone completely unnoticed before. My mother hosted a small neighborhood gathering. Nothing extravagant, just coffee and pastries in the backyard. For years, those gatherings followed a predictable script. Daniel's achievements were highlighted. My work was summarized in one vague sentence. But this time, when Mrs. Holloway from next door asked what I had been working on, my mother didn't hesitate. Elise just completed a joint coordination review with 3 international units, she said confidently. It required months of preparation. I froze for half a second. She didn't look at me for approval. She didn't soften the language. She didn't downgrade it into something digestible. She simply stated it as fact. Later, when the neighbours left, I asked her why she had phrased it that way. She shrugged gently. "Because that's what you did." That was it. No theatrics, no apology woven into it, just accuracy. Accuracy felt better than praise ever could. That afternoon, Daniel showed up unexpectedly. He carried a folder. "I've been thinking about what the Colonel said," he began, "about recognizing strength." He placed the folder on the table. Inside were proposals for a non-profit partnership connecting small businesses with veteran-led consulting services. "I thought maybe we could collaborate," he said cautiously. I looked up at him. "You want to work with me?" "I want to work with you," he corrected. The difference mattered. For years, collaboration had meant me supporting him quietly. Now he was asking for equal footing. "It won't be symbolic," I warned. "If we do this, it's real work." He smiled faintly. "I know." My father joined us outside later that evening. "You two arguing yet?" he asked lightly. "Negotiating," Daniel replied. Dad laughed, but there was something proud in it. Not pride rooted in hierarchy, pride rooted in growth. As the sun lowered over the backyard fence, I realized something subtle but important. The transformation in my family didn't come from humiliation. It didn't come from confrontation alone. It came from exposure followed by reflection. The Colonel's words opened the door, but what kept it open were consistent choices afterward. No more minimizing jokes, no more dismissive introductions, no more closure. Weeks later, at another family dinner, Daniel raised a toast, not to Vanessa, not to himself, but to clear vision. He glanced at me when he said it. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. That night, as I drove home, I thought about the girl who once sat quietly at dinners, shrinking herself to avoid discomfort. She wasn't gone. She had just learned something. You don't have to explode to change a room. You don't have to compete to be seen. Sometimes, all you have to do is stop accepting a smaller version of yourself. My mother once said, "Don't embarrass us." What she meant was, don't disrupt the narrative. But narratives built on distortion eventually collapse, and when they do, the truth doesn't shout. It stands calmly, fully visible, and waits to be acknowledged. There wasn't a dramatic final confrontation, no shouting match that ended in tears, no cinematic moment where everyone suddenly clapped and declared growth. What happened instead was quieter and far more permanent. 6 months after the engagement dinner, Vanessa and Daniel were married. At the ceremony, I stood near the front, not as a novelty, not as a hidden fact, but simply as his sister. When the officiant invited family members to say a few words, Daniel surprised everyone. "There's someone here tonight who taught me something important," he said. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at me. Strength isn't loud. It doesn't compete. It doesn't need applause. It just stands there and waits for you to catch up. The room was silent in a different way this time. Not tense, reflective. My mother didn't flinch. My father didn't shift uncomfortably. They just listened. Afterward, during the reception, my mother approached me near the dance floor. "I used to think protecting you meant keeping things simple," she said. But I was really protecting myself from feeling inadequate. That was the clearest admission she had ever made. "You don't have to understand my world," I replied. "You just have to respect that it exists." She nodded, eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. "I do." Later that evening, Colonel Montgomery found me again. "Looks like things have settled," he said. "They have." He studied me carefully. "You didn't need me to say what I said that night." "No," I admitted. "But it helped," he smiled faintly. "Sometimes truth needs a microphone." As the music carried across the ballroom, I realized something unexpected. The real change hadn't been external. It had been internal. I stopped shrinking. I stopped managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own reality. And when I did that, the entire dynamic shifted. Not because I demanded it, but because I refused to participate in my own minimization. My family didn't transform overnight. They didn't become perfect, but they became aware, and awareness is where respect begins. Months later, during a quiet Sunday dinner at my parents' house, my mother raised her glass and said, "To seeing each other clearly." It wasn't elaborate, it wasn't rehearsed, but it was honest. I raised mine in return, because in the end, that was all I had ever wanted. Not admiration, not applause, just clarity. Mum once told me, "Don't embarrass us." She thought embarrassment came from visibility. She was wrong. Embarrassment came from denial. And when denial finally stepped aside, what was left wasn't humiliation. It was